Welcome to this seminar addressing the impacts of coastal development and climate change on coastal ecosystems and human health. This is a collaborative offering by the American Chemical Society Divisions of Environmental Chemistry and Agrochemicals. I'm George Cobb, the immediate past chair of the ACS Divisions of Environmental Chemistry and the chairman of the Department of Environmental Science here at Baylor University. I'll be the moderator of the webinar, but you're attending to hear from Dr. Geoff Scott. It's my pleasure to introduce Geoff. He's been a longtime friend and colleague. For decades, Dr. Scott has been a leader in the development of coastal ecosystem assessment techniques. Dr. Scott received his Bachelor of Science in Biology from Wofford College and a Master's and PhD in Marine Science from the University of South Carolina. He held positions in the U.S. EPA from 1976 to 1984, and then he moved to the University of South Carolina and rose to the rank of associate professor before NOAA came calling and recruited him away to direct one of their national centers for coastal ocean science, which he did for 15 years. Dr. Scott is currently the chair of the Department of Environmental Sciences at the Arnold School of Public Health at the University of South Carolina. He also holds faculty ranks at other academic institutions. I've always enjoyed hearing from Geoff. He has insightful perspectives, and I'll trust you'll find that he's presenting many of them today as he describes the challenges presented by coastal development and climate change.
Well, George, thank you for that gracious introduction. It is a real pleasure to be here today to talk to you about coastal development and climate change, a recipe for disaster. I'm Geoff Scott, and along with these colleagues listed here, we have tried to put together a seminar that will cover this topic of looking at the intersection of climate change and urbanization. I really want to thank folks at NOAA, Arnold School of Public Health, Environmental Canada, particularly Dr. Tom Peterson at the NOAA National Climate Center. So let's jump right into this topic. Globally, 50% of the world's population lives within 50 miles of the coast. 33 of the 50 largest cities in the world are located at the coast, and 80% of the commerce in the world is transported by maritime transportation. Half of the U.S. population resides within 50 miles of the coast in an area of about 11% of the land area in the lower 48 states. And we continue to see development of the coastal zone despite a number of things such as hurricanes and other things that deter people. Nonetheless, we continue to see the populations thriving to the coast. The Pew Commission did a study where they looked at the conversion of rural land into suburban and urban areas in the past 300 years since man arrived in North America. And they found that 25% of all those land conversions occurred in a 15-year period from 1982 to 1997. So today, if we look in the coastal zone, there are 5.19 times more commercial activity per land area, and there are 5.38 times more people per land area in the coastal zone than in inland areas of the U.S. That increased population abundance and economic activity results in increased emissions of air and water pollution that may impact the coastal zone. So as a result, we see significant impacts to coastal ecosystems. And so that's really what I want to focus on today, because there may be both ecosystem and human health effects. This influx of people and associated residential and commercial development of the coastal zone has resulted in significant modification of the landscape ecology within the coastal zone, particularly increasing imperviousness, which leads to major changes in the hydrological cycle. Those changes in that cycle increase the transport and delivery of water containing contaminants, microbes, and nutrients to the coastal zone. So this cartoon sort of captures this. We have increased urbanization of the land area, along with changes in habitat quality, along with potential impacts on resources that utilize these habitats, and then ultimately man is at the intersection of using those natural resources and those habitats. So this altered or impact water quality may in turn impact ecosystem and human health. So what I really want to focus on today are looking at the effects of increased levels of harmful algal blooms, infectious microbes, and contaminants of emerging concern. So this next slide is a study done by the Harvard School of Public Health looking at major ecological disturbances from 1970 to 1996. And what we really see on that far back panel in this light blue area is the rapid increase in harmful algal blooms, public health events, coral bleaching events, and related disturbances within coastal ecosystems. So how are coastal ecosystems doing? Well, we have a report card called the Coastal Condition Report. 44% of the estuarine ecosystems were impacted due to non-point source pollution. Suzanne Bricker and her colleagues have found that 2/3 of our estuaries and bays in the U.S. are moderately to severely impacted by eutrophication. In 2005, there were 35,000 beach advisories, and 40% of the shellfish beds in the U.S. had harvest restrictions due to urban runoff, discharges from septic tanks, animal feedlots, and wildlife pollution sources. The greatest rate of population change has been in the southeast U.S., the area from Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, to Cape Kennedy, Florida, and as shown in this satellite image. This has resulted in several major studies of urbanization in the southeast, beginning with the Urbanization in Southeast Estuary study, which was a comparative study of Murrells Inlet, a highly urbanized area just south of the Myrtle Beach Grand Strand, and North Inlet, a pristine NOAA National Estuarine Research Reserve site. Looking at these system comparisons within this study, we chose Murrells Inlet because there was no standard industrial code industry, only condominiums, service industries, and related ecotourism related type activities. That led to the production of this first book indicated here, Sustainable Development in the Southeast Coastal Zone. However, we realized that comparing Murrells Inlet and North Inlet, these were bar-billed estuaries without a river running through them. And if you come south down the coast in South Carolina, below Georgetown, all of your estuaries from there south have rivers running through them. So we had to then conduct a second set of urbanization studies to better address the types of pollution we would have in estuaries that have rivers running through them. And so this led to the land use coastal ecosystem study. And we really wanted to look at what we call the compartmental interfaces between the estuarine system, the upland river system, and the pollution that may be brought down from the Piedmont into the coastal plain. And that led to our second book, the Green Book here, Managing Rapidly Developed Coastal Areas. At the end of the day of studying urbanization for about 15 or 20 years, we began by looking in large bays, sounds, large parts of the estuary to monitor. But at the end of the day, what we found was the real pollution sources were actually emanating their way into the estuary through small, tiny tidal creeks. And so this led to the Tidal Creek Project, as indicated in this report here. And this really focused on tidal creeks as sentinel habitats. These are such important areas because they are where we have the highest amount of pollution, and also they're also where we have the earliest life history stages of most of your finfish and shellfish. Thus, if we protect ecosystem health in those tidal creeks, by default, we protect the rest of the system due to the larger assimilative capacity in the larger parts of the estuarine watershed. So today, if we look on the east coast of the U.S., the three fastest growing cities on the east coast are Myrtle Beach, Charleston, and Hilton Head. So indeed, our studies here in South Carolina have been at ground zero for the most rapidly developing portions of the East Coast. This next slide shows you a population trends in the coastal zone. And I will point out, if we take a place like Myrtle Beach, our population doubling times going from 100,000 to 200,000 permanent residents, as you can see, is around 20 years. And the only other place on the planet that has those types of population doubling times is sub-Saharan Africa. And there they are not maintaining environmental quality like we're trying to do here. You'll also notice similar growth rates in both Charleston and Beaufort County, not quite the same rate of growth in Georgetown County. In addition, for every 1% increase in population growth, there is a 5 to 6% increase in urban area. That's because our tendency is to build out and sprawl as opposed to build up. And so this map in Charleston depicts this. Here you can see in 1973, 70 square miles of urban area in Charleston. Today, that's over nearly 10 times higher, over 607 square miles, and you'll notice that will get up almost to 900 square miles in the next 10 or 15 years. So as you can see, this urban footprint is rapidly growing. And if you have population doubling times of 20 years, the population or the doubling time for this urban land area, given that ratio of 5 to 6% for every 1% population growth, your doubling time is around 5 to 6 years for urban area. So you can really see the increase in imperviousness that has occurred in this coastal area. You can also see the movement of the urban footprint up the interstate I-26 toward I-95. And if you look at this slide, you'll really see that we're almost all the way to 95 now. And in fact, if you go to Florida and get off I-95, you may notice that there really are no rural areas. Everything is pretty well urbanized from 95 to the coast, and we're gradually beginning to see that transition here in South Carolina. One of the reasons for the increased imperviousness is the way we build. Our typical lot size today is between 1/4 of an acre and 1/8 of an acre or smaller. And this is percent imperviousness by lot size. So you can see that we end up with 38 to 65% imperviousness with these small lot sizes. Larger lot sizes result in much lower rates of imperviousness and not as much runoff and pollution as a result. This slide really shows you the increase. In a natural forest, about 10% of the rainfall leaves as runoff. When you begin to reach 20% imperviousness, like a 1 acre lot size, you double the amount of runoff. When we get into 1/4 acre, we're at about 30% impervious, or 35 to 40% imperviousness. You see a tripling of the runoff flow and volume. And then as we get into a highly urban area, urbanized city area, over a 5-fold increase in runoff. The reason imperviousness is so important, our studies have shown, as you pay paradise and put up a parking lot, increased imperviousness leads to increased impacts in terms of ecosystem health. When we reach above 10% imperviousness, we begin to see changes in environmental quality, water quality, resource health. As we get above 30% impervious cover, we actually begin to see loss of ecosystem services, primarily fishability and swimmability, the very amenities that draw people to the coast in the first place. This next slide is a graph of all the contaminants found in runoff, the median concentrations for the U.S. in stormwater runoff, and you will see it contains a mixture of nutrients such as phosphorus and nitrogen, trace metals such as copper, lead, and zinc, oxygen-demanding waste, petroleum hydrocarbons, and microbial contaminants, both fecal, coliform, and fecal strep. And I'm not going to go through all the units on these. I think that each watershed will be different, but these are the median concentrations. So just to give you a number, fecal coliform levels of 15,000. That's the safe standard for shellfish harvest is 14. So 15,000, that means you're loading water into these shellfish harvest areas at thousands of times above what will be sustainable. Now, if we begin to really summarize all these studies of urbanization, we can kind of break our findings into 4 slides depicted here that sort of summarize what we found. We basically found increased population density results in increased imperviousness throughout tidal creeks in South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia, throughout that entire southeast region. Again, as we look at the runoff flow, one of the things we see in a forested watershed, very low flow rate. As we move into urban and suburban areas, the runoff flow is much higher velocity. The best way to think of this, if you have a water hose in your backyard and you turn it on low without a nozzle on the end of the hose, the water runs slow, it percolates into the yard and seeps into the soils. And that's what we see in the forested watershed. However, if you put a nozzle on that hose and spray it out and begin spraying your yard, you will immediately begin to erode soil, wash up your grass, and on that soil attached to it will be nutrients, microbes, and chemical contaminants. And it is really these higher velocities that we get off suburban and urban areas due to the increased imperviousness that lead to the increased pollution loading within urban areas. These bottom slides simply show the increased level of fecal coliform bacteria with increased flow and imperviousness as a result. And then this is a measure of cumulative chemical contaminants, trace metals, pesticides, and PCBs in soil using sediment quality guidelines. And as you can see, again, the increase with increasing imperviousness for chemical contaminant levels. So at the end of the day, we were able to put together a conceptual model indicated here that really sort of puts all this into perspective. We have our stressors, increased population density, altered land cover, increased imperviousness. That leads to increased exposure of microbes, chemical contaminants, and nutrients. That in turn, as we move up to about 20 to 30, and that's above 10 to 20% imperviousness, we get to 20 to 30%, we begin to see changes in ecosystem health. And then above 30%, we clearly see loss of ecosystem services, particularly beach closures and shellfish bed closures, and increased vulnerability to flooding. Well, if you wanted to end the seminar right now, that's a pretty significant amount of information just on urbanization. But then now we have this other 600-pound gorilla in the room called climate change. And so what I really want to talk to you about the rest of the seminar is how climate change will interact with what we know in terms of urbanization. And I think as I'll show you, this is why I call it a recipe for disaster. So let's move right into our discussions now on climate change. So urbanization really affects three major cycles: the hydrological cycle, the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle. And as we have increased nitrogen and phosphorus loading, this leads to hypoxia, lack of oxygen, and eutrophication, increased nutrient levels that will increase microbial populations, as well as cause harmful algal blooms. And this slide just illustrates 2/3 of our estuaries that are moderately to severely eutrophic in the United States. Now, climate change affects the carbon cycle. And so how will this future change in climate change from affecting the carbon cycle affect urbanization? Well, you've all seen these slides looking at changes in CO2 in the atmosphere here in red. Here's the levels of CO2 in seawater and the concomitant decline in pH, otherwise known as ocean acidification, that results of the increased solubility of CO2 and carbonic acid within watersheds. All of this is related to increasing combustion of fossil fuels. Present levels of CO2 are in advance of 400 parts per million. They have increased by 25% since the start of the Industrial Revolution, 12% since 1960. This carbon dioxide increase has caused about a 1 degree Fahrenheit increase in global temperatures during the 20th century. Projections are for these CO2 levels to double by 2050. Which will increase global temperatures by 1.5 to 4.5 degrees C. Now, if we take a look at global climate change in terms of the composition of greenhouse gases, we mentioned the CO2. It contributes about 55% of the total greenhouse gases. The chlorofluorocarbons, the CFCs, are next, about 24% of the total greenhouse gases. On a molecular basis, the CFCs are 12,000 times more potent than CO2 at absorbing infrared radiation, and they're increasing at 5% a year, which means they're going to double in the next 20 years. So the CFCs, particularly as the climate gets even warmer, we're going to continue to see those numbers rise. Methane is the next contributor, 15% of the total greenhouse gases, 20 times more potent than CO2 at absorbing infrared radiation, increasing at a rate of about 1 per year, and then the nitric oxide, about 6% of total greenhouse gases, in much lower concentrations, but still increasing at about 0.25% per year. Now, if you want to learn about climate change, the best and authoritative reports on the subject are the Intergovernmental Panel, the IPCC, reports on climate change produced every 5 years. They're intensely peer-reviewed, and they're available right here at this website if you want to go online and take a look at yourself at the most up-to-date peer-reviewed information. Dr. Tom Peterson is a climatologist senior scientist climatologist at the Asheville Climate Center in North Carolina. And he has given some slides that I'm sharing with you now to talk about some of the information in this report. He is a member of the IPCC. And the first thing Dr. Peterson would say, if you take a look at these are the different emission, high, moderate, and low emission scenarios for future CO2 emissions from fossil fuels. And the first thing he would show you is this little yellow box right here. If we blow it up, of what we know now, the black line is the model. These color lines, the black line are actual CO2 concentrations. The color lines are the different emission models. The first thing he would point out is the models are highly conservative. They underestimate the current CO2 concentrations. So the first thing he would tell you, the models are accurate, but they are highly conservative. The second two things about CO2 he would remind you of: 1/3 of the CO2 emitted today in the atmosphere will still be there 100 years from now, and 1,000 years from now, 20% of it will still be there. So what we do today will continue to be in the atmosphere and affect our society for generations to come. So how will climate change affect ocean health? What are the real ocean health threats? Well, it may directly affect the growth, survival, persistence, distribution, transmission, and virulence of disease-causing organisms and harmful algal blooms, and also the concentrations of chemical contaminants and their cycling in coastal ecosystems. It may also affect disease vectors that help transmit disease. And then we know that the climate factors are really temperature, precipitation, or lack of, flooding or drought, or runoff, and then sea level rise, salinity, extreme weather events, and then these ecological shifts that we may see in different species. So let's begin by talking about the effects of increased temperature. The increased melting of polar ice will be one of the results. Now, one of the things we often don't think about is that ice melts. It is sequestered over the years, lots of airborne pollution that's been transported to the poles. But we're now through the Industrial Revolution, and now in the course of the next 20 to 30 to 40 years, we're going to rapidly release all those contaminants sequestered in that ice into boreal ecosystems in the Arctic and Antarctic. This will result in the increased release of trace metals, organic pollutants like DDT, and other contaminants into these ecosystems. This is a slide of recent changes in global temperature. So as you can see, starting in 1880, annual variability with a normalized best fit line through them, these points. And as you can see, we're right at that about a 1 degree centigrade change over this time period. Now, one of the things that will happen with climate change, we will see increased numbers of days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. For example, in Washington, The C will go from 1 day per year to over 14 days per year. And I always like to say in T's, that really depends on how often Congress is in session with the additional hot air coming from that body. We also know if we look at a place like Dallas, we see we'll go from 19 days per year to 78 days per year of over 100-degree weather. You may remember 3 years ago, Dallas went 42 straight days above 100, finished that summer with 70 days. So Dallas is already almost to that 78-day threshold. And we use 100 degrees Fahrenheit because that is a temperature where people begin to stay indoors and avoid the extremes. People have to change or modify their behavior to still work out and do things outside, go early in the day or late in the day. We also will see in the Midwest, the breadbasket in the Midwest will move farther north into Minnesota and northern Canada. And so that area will have, of the current Midwest, will have much smaller amounts of rains, and that will cause drought. And then we also see the plants there that we try to grow, like soybeans, the P3 plants, are not going to compete as well as the P4 plants of the weeds. And because the P4 plants, the weeds do better in high enriched CO2 environments. That means we're going to have to use more herbicides to control the competitive weeds. Also, your insects, in order to meet their protein demands due to the lower protein content of the P3 plants they try to graze on, they will have to use more insecticide to control those. This is a slide looking at the current change in temperature. I'll point out this is in degrees Fahrenheit on the scale. And so let's take our current projection from 2011 to 2029. You can see that we have seen in the lower 48 states about a 3-degree Fahrenheit shift, and we're expecting to see in the Arctic shifts all the way up to 6 degrees Fahrenheit over this time period. We then go to the mid-century and end of century high emission, low emission scenario, and you'll notice that as the more of the heat extreme is exchanged and moved away from the equator to the poles, we particularly see the more dramatic increase in temperatures in the polar regions. In fact, by the end of the century, we're looking at temperatures of well over 10 degrees Fahrenheit higher than they are today. So the best way to explain this, Dr. Peterson likes to use the concepts of moving state to talk about these changes over the next 100 years. The climate in New England over the next 100 years will become like the climate in Raleigh. The climate in Chicago will become more like the climate in Dallas. So that's the concept of moving states as we see our weather change. If you go through the reports, lots of tables, too small a print to read here. I'll just blow up and tell you what those boxes say. Overall, we're going to see more extreme weather, increased temperatures, warmer nights, fewer colder days, increased heat waves, increased heavier precipitation events like large mesoscale systems. We'll talk about that later. Increased periods of drought, increased tropical cyclone activity, and increased sea level rise. We've talked about air temperatures, but let's look at surface water temperatures of our oceans. This is looking at changes over a 34-year period from 1970 to 2004. Scale is in degrees centigrade, and the red areas that you see indicate areas where the sea temperatures have increased 3.5 degrees C. And you'll notice, again, in Alaska and these higher latitudes, ocean currents are moving that heat further north away from the equator to distribute the heat out across the planet. So climate extremes are differential because of the ocean currents that help move the heat away from the equators. So we clearly know the Arctic and Antarctic regions are the areas under greatest temperature warming. The Arctic region is likely to warm 7 to 13 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 to 7 degrees C in the last half of the century, of this century, the 21st century. We noticed that average temperatures in Antarctica have increased by 6 degrees C over the last 30 years. So we're seeing melting of glaciers and other Arctic habitat as indicated here. And this puts many species like polar bear, Adele penguins, walruses, over some 279 species of plants and animals that are being affected by having to move and basically will result in loss of significant ice habitat and possibly extinction of some of these species. Now, if we take a look at the levels of trace metals in this melting ice, these are the levels of lead, mercury, and cadmium in parts per trillion in the ice that is melting. So you can see these are low concentrations, but nonetheless, we are melting large volumes of ice in a very short period of time. If we look at the persistent organic pollutants, we see things like endosulfan, chlorpyrifos, atrazine, contemporary use pesticides, DDT, a legacy pollutant. The levels of endosulfan range from 30 to 360 parts per trillion. Trace levels, but the water quality criteria for endosulfan is 8 parts per trillion. So these levels are well above water quality criteria. Endosulfan has caused more fish kills in the U.S. than all other pesticides combined. It has been banned and phased out, but it's still persistent in the ice. It has a very high Henry law constant and favors aerial transport to distant locations. Also, we see chlorpyrifos, about 16 parts per trillion, water quality criteria, 6.9 parts per trillion. Again, ice melt levels above water quality criteria. And then we also see atrazine at about 2 parts per trillion. The co-occurrence of atrazine and chlorpyrifos is most notable. These two compounds are synergistic when exposed together and basically particularly to invertebrates. And so we're very concerned about things like krill and other things and how their health and well-being is occurring in these Arctic systems since they're so important as a food source. Then we take a look at compounds like DDT, about 18 parts per trillion. And again, if we look at the West Antarctic ice sheet, it's losing ice at a rate of about 210 gross tons per year, releasing about 1 to 4 kilograms of DDT per year. If we take a look, in addition to these increased exposures to these compounds, this may result. We are also seeing increased global temperatures that may enhance and interact with the toxicity of the low levels of these contaminants. And this next slide illustrates results of this. This is a study published in Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry, where low levels of endosulfan and chlorpyrifos were used to expose 4 species of freshwater fish. I'll just pick out one species, rainbow trout. Their upper thermal tolerance is about 25 to 30 degrees C. When we add in these low levels of endosulfan and test their upper thermal tolerance, it lowers their upper thermal tolerance by 5 to 6 degrees centigrade, down below 20 degrees C. So at the very time we are turning up global temperatures in the water temperature, we're turning down the thermostats of these freshwater fish. And this situation, we believe, in some areas will lead to extinction, at least in terms of the range for certain areas for rainbow trout and some of these other freshwater species. Other species will come in probably and take their place that have higher thermal tolerances, but we're going to be restricting the habitat for these species. Another thing we have found is that most pesticides are currently tested under optimum temperature and salinity, what we call standard temperature and salinity, which is 20 parts per thousand, salinity 20 degrees C. This black line is the survival of grass shrimp, the species right here, and its normal standard tolerance. You see that when we add high salinity, it doesn't really change the toxicity of the compound. However, when we add in the combination of high temperature and high salinity, we shift the LC50 by about a factor of 4. And right now, we are not currently basing risk assessments on pesticides on anything other than the standard temperature and salinity, not the extremes that we may see more frequently in the future. The other thing that is concerning is not every pesticide is predictable in the same way. For thalonil, we see an increase in toxicity on the perethrin resmethrin. Here's your standard curve. Here's your standard curve with temperature and salinity. It doesn't really shift the curve very much except at the higher concentrations. And salinity, again, high salinity has no effect. So it means we have to test each individual chemical in order to know how to understand and predict their risk in the future. But current risk assessment under FITHRA does not take this into account. Now, EPA has held workshops. We've made recommendations for them to begin to move in this area. And I'm sure as we see more and more information coming in on this issue, they will move responsibly in this area. Now, we also have seen ecological shifts of marine organisms. We can see increased occurrences of marine animal disease, human disease associated with microbes and harmful algal blooms. I'm going to start with a slide of something real simple, not microbes or harmful algal bloom species. This is simply plant hardiness zone species. So you'll notice in 1990, this little tip in Missouri has primarily plant hardiness zone 6 and 7, light green and yellow. You'll notice by 2006, now that yellow has spread all the way up into southern Ohio, up higher areas of Missouri. Zone 6 has grown all the way up into Wisconsin and Michigan. So you can really begin to see this transition further north, and you can see by the end of the century, we see movement, complete replacement of plant species throughout most of this area. We also know that we can get movements of microbes. This is Vibrio bacteria. We all know about Vibrio cholera, very common in drinking water outbreaks following natural disasters. Its first cousins, Vibrio parahemolyticus and Vibrio vulnificus, are very, very significant human health issues. Vibrio vulnificus is responsible for 95% of the fatalities associated with seafood consumption. It has a fatality rate of 50 to 60%. It can kill by both consumption of oysters as well as wound infections. And these are examples of Vibrio vulnificus infections, wound infections in this case on the leg. And basically it moves right up, and the only thing you can really do at this point is amputate because it moves so quickly. And it does have this very high fatality rate. Vibrio parahemolyticus causes about 8,000 cases per year. Rita Caldwell has been looking at the rate of Vibrio infections globally. They have increased by 41% in the last decade, and particularly of concern is the increase of about 31% in the rate of antibiotic resistance. Higher temperatures tend to make the Vibrios turn on resistant genes as a response. We've also seen for Vibrio parahemolyticus a 1,000-kilometer range extension from Vancouver to southern Alaska. What used to be primarily a disease in the Gulf of Mexico is now found in the Gulf of Alaska. And it's interesting, this outbreak in oysters in Alaska in 2004, it was the first time daily temperatures were sustained at 15 degrees C during July and August in recorded historical weather records of that region. Baker Austin has also seen range extensions of the same species into the North Sea and Europe. The other thing that is very disconcerting with the Vibrios is the change in some of the etiology of the disease. The Vibrios now are occurring with greater frequency and regularity to cause wound infections. In some cases, like Vibrio damsella, almost exclusively wound infections. Vibrio algalynicus the same way. And we see about an equal split with the Vibrio parahemolyticus and vulnificus. About half to a third of the cases are wound infections. Now, one of the things, if we look at the seasonality, the typical seasonality of infection, this is mainly a disease in July, August, and September. Whether it's gastroenteritis from moisture consumption or wound infections, they peak during those summer months of high temperature. However, if we take a look at 2 10-year comparisons of disease rates for Vibrio vulnificus, looking at the 10-year period from 1989 to 97, and then 1998 to 2007, comparing the month of April and November for those two 10-year periods. The stripe bars are the increased numbers of days, percentage of days, where temperatures are above 20 degrees C, where this Vibrio species will thrive. And then the gray bars are the increased number of cases. So you can see over that 20-year period, the number of cases nearly increased by a factor of 4. You'll see that the number of days above 20 degrees in November similarly doubled, as they did here in the April time period. And again, number of cases nearly doubled. And so this is a big concern because what this now means is what normally was an illness just in the month of July, June, July, and August, now is becoming an illness for almost 8 to 9 months of the year, April through November. And again, this is because of the higher rates of climate temperatures. This next slide shows a map of all the different harmful algal bloom species throughout the United States. And these are all marine by and large, with the exception of the cyanobacteria, which can be both brackish and freshwater. And I want to particularly pay attention to paralytic shellfish poisoning. This blue dot, you can see it occurs along the west coast and Alaska and also in the northeast U.S. These harmful algal bloom organisms cause fish kill, mass strandings of marine mammals. They cause closure of beaches, and yes, they can cause closure of drinking water, as we have seen in Toledo, Ohio. This slide shows a comparison of the distribution of paralytic shellfish poisoning cases in 1970 versus today. And we have clearly seen a tremendous increase in the number of cases over the last 45 to 50 years. Just an unbelievable increase. And again, notice the range extension throughout South America, Southeast Asia, and around the world. Again, as we saw with the Vibrios, this is a species of Hab species, Alexandrium cantonella, found in Puget Sound. It normally shuts down shellfish harvesting for about 109 days, again, the warmest time of the year when temperatures are above 13 degrees C, June, July, August, and September, very much like we showed with the Vibrios. However, as we increase temperatures by 2 degrees C, now we extend this out to nearly almost 6 months of the year. And as you can see, if we go to 4 to 6 degrees C, what is normally just a problem in the summer months is now becoming a problem throughout much of the year, shutting down the shellfishery in Puget Sound for much, much longer periods of time. Now, in addition, we have talked about the marine species of harmful algal blooms in those preceding slides, but I will point out they only account for about 46 of the 3,301 total cases of HABs from 2007 to 2011. 96% of the HABs occur in freshwater, with about 80% of those being microcystin. So as you can see, the freshwater toxins are a huge concern. They are also a concern because we are seeing increased numbers of cases of chemical poisonings in drinking water and contact recreation from the microcystin toxin from these blue-green algae. We all remember in August 2014 when Toledo, city of 500,000 people, had to close down their drinking water. Governor John Kasich had to declare a state of emergency. Some 25 million people live in the Great Lakes and in adjoining regions that could have been potentially affected. Lake Erie is the shallowest of the Great Lakes, and here we see an aerial satellite view of the bloom throughout the lake, and here's Toledo, and this led to the closure of the drinking water there. EPA began, as a result of this, to begin a lake survey across the U.S., and they found looking at 123,000 acres and 10 acres or size or more, 33% of them have these freshwater cyanobacteria blooms. And we also know that in addition to the closure in Ohio, in July 2016, the governor there had to declare an imminent health threat for the 4th of July weekend to avoid contact recreation. Our current EPA guidelines are 0.3 micrograms per liter for microcystin for children, 0.7 for cylindrospermopsins, and then for other groups, adults, 1.6 and 3 respectively for each of these two types of toxins. And we know that climate change is really playing a huge role in moving and increasing the frequency and range distribution of these freshwater HAB blooms. I want to take you to a watershed in north central North Carolina right here, just outside of Raleigh. This is the Falls Lake Reservoir, this drinking water reservoir right through here. Highly urbanized area around Raleigh and Durham. If we take a look, if we look at the harmful algal bloom species we see in the lake, this lake is used for drinking water for Raleigh. We see microcystin, Anabina, Cylindrospermopsis, and also the rapidophytes. So this is about a 25-kilometer run throughout the lake. Joanne Burkholder at NC State has put a number of pigment monitoring stations throughout the lake to monitor for the toxins. And this is why we get very concerned about these cyanobacteria or the toxins. Anatoxin A and saxitoxins that are produced are neurotoxins that affect the central nervous system, very quick onset of effects. The microcystin are hepatotoxins. I'll also show you they affect the kidney, and they're a little slower reaction than hours to days. The cylindrospermopsins also affect the liver and kidney. Now again, if we go back and look at the use of these pigment sensors in Falls Lake, you can see that this is the most upwater site that the pigment sensor goes up and down, and these are different times of the day, and it shows a bloom right in this region right here at about 2-meter depth. Further down in the lake where the drinking water intake is here, the bloom is situated at about 6 meters. So what the city of Raleigh does, they'll either go below or above where the bloom is peaking and get into waters that are much lower in terms of levels of pigment. And by doing that, they save about $10 million a year in treatment costs, because obviously this water is highly enriched and is going to require a lot more disinfectant to polish the water for safe consumption. To fix this watershed in Falls Lake, the urbanization and eutrophication around it, it's estimated to cost about $200 million. Similar problems in the Noosh, Yadkin, other watersheds here leading into Pamplico, Albemarle Sand, and of course we have the Chesapeake Bay with a price tag of $1 to $3 billion for restoration costs. So as you can see, this is a huge issue of urbanization, eutrophication, and harmful algal blooms. Next, I want to take you to a watershed in north central South Carolina at Lake Watery, just outside of Columbia. This is the oldest man-made lake in South Carolina. It was dammed in 1919 to create hydroelectric power to run the textile industry of the state, about 242 miles of shoreline. This region just south of Raleigh is the second fastest growing population area in the state, with the highest population density right along the coast. And so if we look at this lake, what we see is these are long-term monitoring stations that are monitored by a volunteer group. And what they have observed are these large blooms of Lingbia wallii that occur throughout the lake, and as you can see in these photos. This is also seen in Falls Lake. These are slides of the same species in Falls Lake. You can see it growing right around the edge. And this is a saxitoxin producer, which is the neurotoxic, the more toxic form. This was the extent of blooms in 2015, these light green areas up at the upper part of the lake, the middle part, and a little bit down here, but nothing down here by the dam. By 2017, this past year, in June, we saw the extent of the bloom were in these blue areas. By September, the yellow and light blue areas showing bloom distributions throughout the entire lake, and particularly this area right here by the dam. I want to go to the next slide. We're going to blow that area up, this area right here. Here you can see the bloom area right here. This is the drinking water intake for two cities, Camden and Elgin, that use the drinking water out of this reservoir. So we have blooms going on right next to that. One of the big concerns when we look in this area is the rapid increase in chlorophyll over time. And as you can see, the rest of the lake where we see major blooms is already at this 25 part per billion threshold for chlorophyll. And you can see we're rapidly approaching that, and the trend line is clearly showing enriched eutrophication going on in that part of the lake. And as a result, the blooms are spreading. Now, back in 2015, my good friend Brian Brooks and I and a number of other colleagues, we published an ET&C focus article. Are these freshwater harmful algal blooms the greatest threat to public health and aquatic ecosystems? In 2015, these are the number, not of blooms, but health advisories posted by health departments throughout the country as a result of having to restrict contact recreation or the consumption of drinking water throughout the U.S. Most of these advisories occurred in July and August when it's warmest, again correlating with higher temperatures associated with climate change. Most of these involve microcystin. The average microcystin concentration in these vents was 627 micrograms per liter. And the reason that number becomes very significant, if we take a look at contact recreation, when an adult goes swimming, they ingest about 0.016 liters of water. If you multiply that times the average concentration in a bloom, that puts us at about 10 parts per billion, which is well over the drinking water standard. Similarly, children can ingest about twice as much water. Their exposure levels are 23 micrograms. And so again, you can see that's much higher than what we see, the 0.3 to 1.6. So this is a very significant concern, and that is why we had to restrict contact recreation in Florida during the 4th of July weekend. This is the area of interest in Florida around Lake Okeechobee and Stewart, Florida. Maximum concentrations measured were over 300 parts per billion. These are all levels or parts per billion levels, all above safe drinking water levels here around Lake Okeechobee. If we get over here to Stewart, Florida, 400 parts per billion, maximum concentration. Again, all these concentrations, again, are above safe levels for drinking water or contact recreation. So as you can see, this is what the bloom actually looked like. You can see this is in Stewart, Florida on July the 2nd, which is why the governor had to declare a health emergency and restrict contact recreation in the lake. A study by Zwang et al. In 2015 has revealed some most disturbing news in terms of the occurrence of these blooms and liver disease. These are maps at a county level of the bloom coverage throughout the United States. 61 counties in the U.S. have these cyanobacteria blooms. The higher the intense color, yellow, orange, and red, the higher the percent occurrence of blooms. Again, notice the occurrence of high-intensity blooms around our coastal areas where you have higher numbers of people and higher commercial activity, also near the Great Lakes and around the Mississippi River. The slide on the right correlates the occurrence of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is occurring at epidemic proportions in the U.S. And as you can see, the red areas coincide with areas that have high bloom coverage and high occurrence of the disease. So again, you see those right around coastal areas here in the southeast mid-Atlantic. And also we see this area up near Charlotte in the second high bloom cover, high disease occurrence, lower bloom coverage, but still nonetheless we see concern. We now know that for every 1% increase in bloom coverage, there's a 0.3% increase in this non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Now, this disease is occurring at epidemic rates. Prevalence rates estimates range from 5 to 31% of the population. It is 3 to 10 times more prevalent than hepatitis C. So this is one that is occurring, and more information is coming out about it. This is a spectrum of developing fatty liver disease. You have a healthy liver, you eat a fat diet, you simply accumulate fat in your liver. So here we see, as we look at NASH, we begin to get essentially fibrous conditions that are non-reversible, and ultimately this scarred tissue will result in cirrhosis of the liver. These are mice that have been exposed to 10 micrograms, the same level we predicted there from contact recreation, with the average microcystin concentration. Here's a healthy mice, healthy diet, a fat diet, healthy mice. Here's a mice with healthy diet and microcystin. We now begin to see this activation of these stellate cells in the liver that is a prefibrotic stage. And then if you add the fat diet with the microcystin, you see greater occurrence of these stellate cells in the liver. And so this is a great concern, because this means microcystin will enhance the occurrence of liver damage leading to NAFL. Also, we have seen the same thing on the kidney. The microcystin leads to increased glomerular inflammation in the kidney. Again, you see the combination of the NAFL, the fat diet with microcystin. We get the increased occurrence of this alpha SMA marker, which is a marker for this increase in inflammation in the kidney. So what can we do about these harmful algal blooms? One of the things we have been doing is working with a group called the National Phytoplankton Monitoring Network. Steve Morton and Jen Moucher down in Charleston, South Carolina. They founded this network in 2001. They have over 100 active sites across the U.S. that biweekly sample for harmful algal blooms. They're a volunteer network. They collect water samples, take temperature, salinity, other information, weather conditions. They are taught to identify the algae. They're given a digital microscope with a camera when they identify a HAB species. They essentially send the image to Steve, and they will confirm the diagnosis and the measurement and occurrence of the harmful algal bloom species at that location. NOAA can then turn on the satellite and look for the chlorophyll signal to see how big the bloom is at those locations. So it gives NOAA an early warning sentinel system to look for harmful algal blooms. The orange locations are all the coastal sites that Steve and his group currently monitor. They have just been given a grant by EPA to develop an equivalent network for fresh water sites, and you'll see those indicated in the green bars. And so we will become their first site here in South Carolina in Lake Wateree. And so you can see we have sites in North Carolina, Great Lakes particularly, with the many problems they've had up there. Also in Colorado and other places where these blooms have been a problem. And Steve will also say, and we have a site in Brazil. So they're international, and they also have some sites in the Middle East as well. So the groups that do this are civic groups, school groups. Steve and them have a curriculum set up where this is already an approved science elective for state departments of education. They have lesson plans for the teachers, all that's done. So it really makes adoption of this real quick and easy within the volunteer networks. And the school teachers are really good. The kids love it. They can get out and do some science every other week and enjoy the field trip. Now, one of the things we've been able to do by having the volunteer network, we can get boots on the ground. We can take the integration of satellite imagery and also moored buoys so that we can actually measure the toxins, measure the actual algal species, using the chlorophyll signal, see the extent of the bloom. NOAA has been able to develop these early warning forecasts to protect people and have them avoid exposure. And that really is the way to protect human health. NOAA has similarly developed similar forecast products, for example, in the Chesapeake Bay for Vibrio bacteria. So again, the public can avoid high levels of Vibrio vulnificus and other species may occur to avoid wound infections. Now, as we kind of wrap this up, we're going to move in now and talk a little bit about sea level rise and flooding. And so I want to talk particularly about the destruction of property and infrastructure in particular. This is a slide of the climate record for sea level rise. This is the gray is the fossil record, the red is the current instrument record. Here's our most recent models, and then we can see them projected into the future. So as you see, this is a rapidly escalating rise of sea level. Normally, sea level rises about 4 to 8 inches every 100 years. With climate change, we think that rise will be more like 28 to 40 inches. And I like to show these slides, particularly this one right here, the former NOAA lab I ran in Charleston. This is one of Charleston's finest that has gotten caught on an afternoon gully washer thunderstorm that occurred on a flood tide when there's nowhere for the runoff to go because the tide is so high. And even Charleston's finest cannot get out of the way of those types of flooding. And of course, we have vulnerable land in urban and commercial and industrial areas that are, of course, vulnerable to this. One of the things we have done in looking at the potential rise of sea level is to examine whether or not things such as Vibrio bacterial levels will increase in the future. And this is a study we did in Winyah Bay. The yellow numbers are the levels of Vibrio vulnificus. The white are the levels of Vibrio parahemolyticus. And as we come up here right at this area, this is the head of tide. All these stations up through here are less than a couple of parts per thousand salinity. So you can see these Vibrios extend now all the way up into freshwater reaches of the Waccamaw River. If we take a look at the two species, Vibrio vulnificus in blue, parahemolyticus in red, look at the effect of temperature in yellow, you'll notice that the vulnificus peaks under the periods of highest temperature, whereas the VP generally tends to stay pretty constant throughout the eight months of the year we looked at it. If we look in terms of salinity, we see a very preferred salinity for Vibrio vulnificus at or around 20 to 25 parts per thousand, whereas the VP, you'll notice it prefers much lower salinities of less than 10 parts per thousand, indicated by the orange bars. We were able to develop an algorithm to predict Vibrio vulnificus densities that use conductivity or salinity measurements, turbidity, and temperature. And using that model, we could explain 62% of the variability in the vulnificus distributions. Working with the late Dr. Paul Conrad and Dan Tufford, we were then able to work with them as they developed a neural network model that took the 13 different climate models that would predict increased or decreases in precipitation, in this case mostly drought in the southeast or lack of rainfall, which could then be integrated in a neural network model with a sea level rise model that would show the increased salt water coming up the river. So the lack of fresh water coming down the river due to drought, along with the increased salinity from sea level rise, means that we're going to see higher salinity conditions in the future at areas further upriver. We trained the model using a historic record from 1981 to 2010, and then Paul was able to forecast the model out into the future. And so this is simply the change in specific conductance or salt content. And so this is out into the future all the way to 2070, and you can see 0 sea level rise, 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot. You can see that as we get into these higher rates of sea level rise, every time you have one of those spikes at that location, that means your drinking water in Georgetown is not going to be useful for consumption by the public. And as you can see, this becomes a event that occurs with greater and greater regularity depending upon the amount of sea level rise we have. We were then able to take our algorithm for the Vibrios and do the same projection. Here's without any sea level rise. These spikes are optimal growth conditions for Vibrios and vulnificus. And what we see is with a 3 foot sea level rise, we see over a 10-fold increase in the occurrence of optimum growth conditions for Vibrio bacteria. And so that is a huge issue, because what that means is we're probably going to see greater distributions of Vibrio growth conditions in larger portions of watersheds into the future. The other disconcerting thing is there are only 3 illnesses currently, bacterial illnesses tracked by CDC, that have increased rates of illness, and by far the one that has the greatest increase are the Vibrios compared to the Salmonella or Campylobacter. All these other illnesses are declining. And so the Vibrios, really, we think this is an indication of climate change interactions. If we take a look at the healthcare costs associated with these illnesses, they cost us about, from the HABs and the infectious microbes, they cost us over $900 million a year in healthcare costs. The HABs, about $350 million. Beach closures, about $300 million in healthcare costs. The Vibrios alone cost us $30 million a year. And if we see a tenfold increase in growth conditions, that number, if it corresponds accordingly, could be as high as $300 million just for Vibrio infections in the future. The other reason we are concerned about this rise in occurrence of the Vibrios, and particularly the increased number of wound infections, this slide sort of explains why. This is looking at some 350 isolates collected from Charleston to Brunswick in the southeast United States, including the Ace Basin, a NOAA National Estuarine Research Reserve. You'll notice that out of those 350 isolates, only 1 isolate had no antibiotic resistance. The remainder of the isolates had resistance to 2 or more antibiotics. They were multiple antibiotic resistance, all the way to 13 resistance to as many as 13 mainline antibiotics. The mean average occurrence of resistance was about 8 to 9 antibiotics. So what that means, when you get a wound infection, it is going to be an antibiotic resistant infection, and if they do not treat the right antibiotic for the infection, this can kill you. And so this becomes a very major issue in terms of protecting public health. In fact, so much so, the Prime Minister of Great Britain commissioned a study by O'Neill, published in 2014, to look at this globally. Currently, this blue line right here indicates there are about 700,000 deaths annually globally each year due to antibiotic resistance, compared to like 8.2 million cases of cancer per year. And we already see 100,000, 120,000 deaths due to cholera. Well, you'll notice that by 2050, if we look at the current rate of increase in antibiotic resistance, we'll see over 10 million deaths a year, which in 2050 will exceed the current number of deaths we have today from cancer. This has caused such great concern. The healthcare system in Great Britain is having to plan to how to deal with these rising numbers of cases in terms of escalating healthcare costs, which is why the study was commissioned. The other serious thing is the lack of new antibiotics. This is the declining number of new antibiotics since the 1980s. And in 2015, the last pharmaceutical manufacturer in the U.S. got out of the business of making new antimicrobials, and mainly because, unlike other drugs, is like a wonder drug for cancer or heart disease, they're immediately used in large numbers of drugs are sold. When you develop a new antibiotic, we hoard it, don't use it at all, only use it on the worst cases of infection, and the manufacturers can never recoup their investment for developing the drug, which is why the CEOs, in responding to their shareholders, are not going to develop these drugs. So unless the federal government steps in and subsidizes this, we're going to be looking at having a real shortage of new antibiotics for evolving infections. The other final big concern I want to talk about with this rise of sea level is the potential for flooding. And here we see the projected forecast of, how much this is going to rise, almost up to 70 to 80 inches under the most extreme forecast. Well, if we take a look at Charleston, for example, we already see that since 1970, we've seen about a 5-inch rise in sea level. And we can see that charted out, 2-inch all the way up to, 5 inches during this time period. This has led to increased occurrences of flood events, going from about 2 events in 1970 to over 12 events by 2010. In fact, we call these flood events king tides. They essentially occur when water levels reach about 7 feet above mean low water. Normal high tide is about 5.5 feet. And these can occur naturally due to the sun-moon position, what we call perigeal tides. But with sea level rise, these are occurring with greater occurrence because of the increasing height of the water itself. And this leads to nuisance flooding. In fact, this is a projection of days of nuisance flooding, such as when the crosstown in Charleston, the street connecting Mount Pleasant and West Ashley in the Holy City Peninsula there is flooded. And you can see that these numbers of days in 2008, 9, and 10 were over 30 days a year of nuisance flooding and have been on the dramatic increase since the 1920s. And what happens is this is the kind of flooding we're talking about. And of course, the greater frequency of this occurring means you have water underneath houses causing mold and other problems because really these sites never dry out. This sort of cartoon explains the problem. Today, here's your average high tide. You have minor flooding from a king tide. You still have a buffer between that height and the height of your house. It would take moderate flooding from like a hurricane or a tropical storm to really put water into your home. But you'll see within just a few years, as sea level rises, now that water is lapping right at the doorstep with the king tide. And then you'll see by 2045, these king tides will be pushing water into your home with regularity. How regular? In fact, we'll move from 12 events per year today to 70 events per year by 2030, and to more than every other day, more than 180 events every other day by 2045. That means homes are never going to dry out from the moisture. The mold problems underneath these homes are going to be dramatic. It also means we have to change infrastructure. We may have to elevate roadways, other infrastructure things that will be impacted. Other evidence of this problem already starting to occur with sea level rise is shown out on Edisto Island. We have done a study there looking at the bacterial sources, and the majority of the bacterial sources there are from dogs and birds, not human sources. People feeding birds on the beach, and this is one of the few beaches where you can take your dog on the beach all day. You're supposed to clean up behind them, but not all tourists do. Well, the problem is if we have a regular high tide, as we see here, we see that the beach is basically not flooded. But if we have a king tide, just a 1 foot increase in height, now you begin to see more and more of the beach, the light blue here. Also, it comes into the marsh here as well. And as we cover more of that beach where dogs and birds are defecating, you increase the occurrence of fecal coliform bacteria in the water for contact recreation. In fact, one of the things we found was that in looking at 16 years of data, the peak occurrence of bacterial closures on the beach occur in the month of September. That also happens to be the month of greatest tropical storm activity. But I will also point out, if we look to this most recent trend from 2011, 70% of your beach closures occur in that 1 month. And what's most interesting, when we look at the seasons with the greatest frequency of king tides for the southeast, it's the fall. It's in that month of September. So here we clearly see evidence of sea level rise influencing contact recreation here on a tourist beach. The other thing I want to close on is talking about the increased flooding or occurrence of heavy precipitation events. We know that we are potentially going to see greater extreme weather runoff and drought. And in fact, when we have drought, we have greater periods of dry deposition of airborne pollution. Thus, when it rains, we wash off greater pollutant loads of nutrients, contaminants, and microbes into our watersheds. And this can affect fishability and swimmability in these areas. The other thing that is occurring is we are having much greater intensity of precipitation today. The average occurrence of heavy precipitation, intense events above 1 inch of rain, has gone up about 20% in the southeast. You'll notice in the northeast it's gone up by as much as 67% from 1958 to 2007. So if you think it rains a lot harder today, it does, and your eyes are not deceiving you. One of the factors in causing this increase in rainfall intensity and volume are what we call these mesoscale convective events. And we know that with climate change, if we go to this next slide, the increasing temperature is driving the tops of the thunderheads about a half a mile further into the upper into the atmosphere. That higher height results in about a 30 to 80% increase in rainfall volume, a 50 to 40% increase in rainfall rate, a 20 to 70% increase in rainfall area. And the other thing, by driving the thunderheads higher into the atmosphere, it anchors a storm so it doesn't move. Thus, we get these major floods like we had in South Carolina in 2015 with 26 inches of rain in Mount Pleasant. And then what we had this past year with Harvey, over 60 inches of rain over a week's period of time as these storms just stall out and flood. So the biggest thing that is really scary, a recent article has appeared both in the flood in South Carolina and Harvey. They were considered a 1 in a century event or 1 in 2,000 year event in Harvey. However, recent model predictions now indicate that the odds have already shifted this occurrence in Texas to a 1 in 17 year event because of climate change. And by the end of the century, the model shows that an event like that occurred in Harvey will become a 1 in 6 year event for the state of Texas. So what that means is these types of large meteorological scale events are going to occur with greater frequency. We're going to continue to see this increased type of flooding associated with that. And of course, with that, we have the occurrence of things like, emerging contaminants like flame retardants, antibiotics. And of course, we see increased rates of things like antibiotic resistant bacteria in the waters. And we even see in dolphins, who are our best sentinel in our systems, that we see 39% of our dolphins in Charleston, if we swab their rectum or blowholes, have resistant antibiotic E. coli. So what that means is the pathway of exposure is complete, and we have to be very concerned about this intersection of climate change with urbanization in placing these emerging contaminants into aquatic and estuarine ecosystems. So what can we do about this? Well, one of the things we can do is what President Obama did, and that was improve fleet mileage in cars up to 45 miles per gallon. That will reduce CO2 emissions by 40%, adopt renewable energy such as solar, wind, and replace conventional fossil fuels. We need to try to phase out coal-fired power plants. This is a very expensive proposition, but it is occurring. We need to plant more forests so we can sequester more CO2. We need to consider disincentives for using fossil fuel. And I think we have to diversify our energy options to include nuclear where that makes sense. One of the things on climate change that makes it really unfair is the 9 out of the 10 people affected by climate change in terms of human health will be in the poor countries of the world. If you look at the disability adjusted lost years for health effects in the developed nations of Europe, Russia, and the United States, you'll see the disability adjusted lost years are very low compared to places like Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. So we know that this will be disproportionately burdensome to the poor countries of the world. And so we know that about 310 million people are expected to have suffered ill health because of climate change by 2030. But I want to leave you, though, with some good news. Lester Brown, if you've ever read any of the books called State of the World, whatever year, 2010, 1990, I mean, Lester wrote every one of those books, 51 books that he's written. His last book that he wrote before he retired, he's 84 years old, was The Great Transition. And this is about his evidence of showing the adoption of renewable energy technology. So here's some of his evidence in his great book, The Great Transition. Denmark and Spain have now anywhere from 20 to 34% of all their energy is renewable energy. States in the United States like Iowa and South Dakota and Texas, 10 to 26% of their energy is now renewable, primarily from wind. Same in Europe, most of that is wind and solar. If we take a look from 2010 to 2014, we saw a decrease in the number of coal-fired power plants in the U.S. decline from 500 to 343. That is a 25% reduction. We are phasing those plants out and modernizing them with lower emitting natural gas plants and other technologies, wind, and obviously people are adopting solar. During 2007 to 2013, China also saw a decline of 18%. And then the final statistic he throws out is from 94 to 2013, the number of gas stations in the U.S. declined by 25%. Why? Higher fleet mileage in cars. People just need less gas. And when we go to 45 miles per gallon, he predicts another 20-25% reduction because we're just not going to need them because cars are going to be more efficient. So I'll leave you with two cartoons to wrap this up. This first one is from and these are both from Tom Peterson. What if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? Talking about climate change. And you could lead through that. Energy independence, sustainability, green jobs, livable cities, clean air, clean water, healthy children. Even if we're wrong, we're right. And I don't think we still debate this issue on climate change, but I think the things we're talking about are all sensible things for a better environment in the future for future generations to come. Then the last one I like is this one. If a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? And of course they answer, sound waves exist regardless of anyone's presence. So of course they're still sound. And then to which she retorts, science is a metaphysical party pooper. To which he replies, I tend to think of it as a designated driver. And I think when we deal with climate change and urbanization, we have to deal with sound science. If we make decisions based on political science, like we've done in the past, that is fraught with all sorts of problems. We need to use sound science. Let it be our guide in making the right decisions now and into the future. And with that, I thank you for the opportunity to present today, and look forward to any questions you may have. Thanks.